Thank you, everybody, for joining us. First, let me introduce my panel before it gets too deep into this. I want to make sure that everybody is acknowledged here. Right next to me, Arturo Vargas, who's the executive director, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. Is it NALEO?
NALEO.
NALEO. Perfect. Okay. It's Linda Lake, who is pollster, long time. We've known each other for
since we were
120 years.
Obviously.
She's the president of Lake Research Partners. Eric Liu, many of you, I think, have seen him before. He's here with the Aspen Institute. He's also the founder and CEO of Citizens University. Chris Matthews, who I've also known for a million years, the president of Bellwether Research and Consulting. And Mimi, who I've not met, but I'm very glad to have met, excuse me, Marziani, who's the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project. We are talking about voting. We're going to start with the midterm elections, and probably one of the biggest political tropes out there is, it all comes down to turnout, right? We don't know anything. We just got to figure out it all comes down to who's going to turn out and vote. Except it is actually the most important thing in every election. We talk about candidates, we talk about campaign spending, we talk about a whole host of issues, but who turns out and who doesn't turn out, and I think that's also important to address, really determines who wins and who loses, and then, of course, what our policy looks like going forward. And that's what I want us to dig into, not just who turns out and who doesn't, but why they do, why they don't, what they care about, what they don't. Can they get access to voting in the same way as other voters do? And so I'm going to start off by asking these guys some specific questions. I'm going to open it up to some more existential questions for you all to ponder, and then open it up to questions. So Celinda and Chris, as our two pollsters on here, I want you guys, Celinda, we can start with you, to talk to us a little bit about the difference between who turns out in a midterm versus who turns out in a presidential. We know that the percentage of voters who turns out much lower in a midterm than a presidential year. And what we think we know thus far about the kinds of people who are going to turn out in 2018, if it's going to look different than we've seen in previous midterms.
So what we know is that if you take the estimates of voters out of 2016, project the population trends, et cetera, that there are 40 million voters, if everything were normal, there are 40 million voters who turned out in 2016 who are not going to show up in 2018, if everything were normal. That's 25 million progressive voters, 25 million from the rising American electorate, a little over 14 million from the non-rising American electorate. We know that includes 11 million unmarried women who are very progressive voters, very motivated by women candidates, but haven't shown up particularly in high numbers in the primaries or the special elections so far. And we know that that's 17 million millennials. And the millennials have had very uneven turnout. They had record high turnout in Virginia, higher than even under
For the governor's race.
For the governor's race, this last year. But been very low in Democratic primaries, and they're voting very Democratic right now. So the short answer is we're not completely clear about that. We do have higher enthusiasm among Democrats and Republicans. We also have higher consolidation. One of the things is we had a lot of people turn out in 2016 who then went and voted for third-party candidates. And now the Democrats are more consolidated than the Republicans, although the Republicans are pretty darn consolidated. And I'll let Chris address that. So we also know that we can't start getting people out to vote 2 days before the election. And we can't just drive up the van and tell them hop in. And we can't say, we've relied a lot on peer pressure and things like that. And we've just finished some new research where we went into people and tried the time-old tradition and said, Amy, your friends and family are voting, you need to vote too, the peer pressure technique. And actually these voters, the millennials and the unmarried women, said, I don't know who your friends and family are, but mine aren't turning out to vote. So either we need non-voters to get new friends and family by election day, that can be kind of hard, or we need to think of some new techniques. So I think it's very, very unclear who's going to turn out to vote, and I think it will be a major factor in 2018.
Yeah, and Chris, normally the turnout that we see, or by normally meaning recently, people who turn out in a midterm election, they're older, it's a whiter electorate, they're more highly educated. That has usually gone to the benefit of Republicans. That's basically, has been traditionally the Republican base. Do you see that continuing? And are there other trends that you're seeing out there that you think this could make a really big difference in the kinds of people who turn out and vote?
Yeah, so I think that there's some X factors in 2018 that are unique and may present a perfect storm. One thing I'm particularly interested in is this young generation. 18-year-olds or turning 18-year-olds. And here's what's happening this election cycle that hasn't happened in previous cycles. The students at Parkland High School, Marjorie Stoneham Douglas, galvanized these kids. I know this because my daughter just turned 18. She attended the largest high school in Virginia, and she and her peers, they walked out with the Parkland kids. They did a registration drive in their AP Gov classes where 300 or 400 of them registered to vote, and all among them, they are planning to vote. And it's really important, I think, that you look at these young people, these 18-year-olds, these 19-year-olds, maybe even 20-year-olds. They are not millennials, and they don't have the attitudes of millennials, and they are, I've looked at some data on this, and I also, observe it with my daughter and her friends. They are angry, but they think that they can do something. They think they can affect change, so that increases their likelihood to turn out to vote. And the Parkland kids on June 15th started a 20-state, 50-city voter registration drive, and their goal is 4 million voters who are turning 18 this year. So this is only June. We've got until November, and probably half the kids haven't turned 18 yet. In some cases, they're registered. So I don't think we're measuring that, and I don't think we're measuring the intensity. These kids are going to turn out. Now, again, don't look at it as a group with millennials, because I don't want to speak for the larger group, but I can tell you these 18 and 19-year-olds feel a real sense of injustice with the shootings and other things that have happened to them. The other X factor that I think is really interesting is the number of women candidates. So we know that single women, younger women tend not to turn out, particularly progressive women, in midterm elections, but we have, record numbers of women candidates, in most cases Democratic women running. And so they're talking about things that are particularly relevant, as Linda and I have worked on some research, Me Too, sexual harassment, healthcare. So I think that we may see some of these younger women looking at these women candidates and say, you're relevant to me. I think there's a reason for me to turn out to vote.
And keeping on that theme about a reason to turn out to vote, Arturo, I want to turn to you for a minute, because we know with Latino voters, their 2016 turnout wasn't much different than, as a percent of the electorate, it wasn't any bigger than it was in 2012. We know that in 2014, the drop-off was, I wrote this down, it was 27% turnout in 2014. Yeah, and that's what I want to ask you about. So that's a 43% drop-off from the 2016 to, the difference between 2014 and 2016. So tell us why there's such a big drop-off in the midterm, and what is it that is either, we can argue, keeping Latino voters from voting, or why they are not interested in voting? What are the candidates and campaigns not doing to attract voters?
We need a whole session just on that.
I know we do.
Okay.
But you only have 2 minutes, so go. There we go.
So the short answer to the abysmal turnout in 2014 is California. California has a third of the Latino vote. And there was absolutely no reason for anybody to vote in California in 2014. Everybody was up for re-election. Nobody campaigned. There was nothing interesting on the ballot. Californians stayed home in droves, including Latino Californians. And that brought down the national Latino turnout.
Got it.
Remember, a third of the electorate that's Latino is in California. Another 25% is in Texas. You take those two states together, 1 out of 2 voters. Why don't Latino voters go out to vote? Because they want to be personally engaged.
Yep.
And the voters in Texas and California are ignored by our political system, political candidates. Hillary Clinton never campaigned in California. She just went there to raise money. Trump never campaigned in Texas. He took it for granted he was going to win. So nobody asked Latinos in those 2 states to vote. And if nobody's asking you to participate, then you feel the political system doesn't work for you, that you're ignored, that candidates just come in, make promises, don't deliver. And that's how many Latinos feel.
What about Arizona, though, a state that was competitive, has been traditionally competitive? Are you seeing that same, are you seeing less of a drop-off then, are you saying, if it's more competitive?
Not so much Arizona as Colorado, because very competitive races in Colorado. Florida, lots of money goes into Florida. And there's a reason why Latino turnout rates are higher in Colorado and Florida, because you spend money mobilizing Latino voters. So follow the money, and very little money follows Latino voters.
How much of it as well is about who's registered and who's not?
Turnout among registered voters, registered Latino voters, is very high. Something like 80% of Latinos registered to vote turn out. But the problem is that of the 27 million who were eligible to vote in 2016, only 14 million were registered to vote. So that's a real problem there. We had about 12.7 million turnout in 2016. So the real problem is eliminating these barriers to voter registration. And when you do systemic changes, like in California, where 17 and 18-year-olds are pre-registering to vote, we're going to have a huge turnout in California. It's in a midterm that does a lot. Huge Latino voter turnout. In a presidential, it's not going to change the national scene very much because of how California votes.
Right. Well, maybe this is what you work on in Texas, right? So talk to us a little bit about access to voting. We can talk specifically about Texas first, and then I'm going to back you up a little bit to talk about more nationally.
Can I reverse that?
You can do whatever you want.
Okay. In my 2 minutes.
Yes.
Well, I wanted to actually zoom back for a second and think for a moment why people vote and why they don't vote on a personal level. It's actually pretty easy. Any political scientist will tell you that all of us do some sort of cost-benefit analysis in our heads. And so if you are very motivated to vote, you think your vote is really important, you think your vote's going to change, somebody's asked you to vote, you're much more likely to vote. On the other side, if you have a lot of questions in those categories or nobody's tried to engage you, then you might not be as motivated, and barriers to voting are going to have a bigger impact. And I like to start there because what drives an individual to vote has a lot of factors. But when we're talking about most people who kind of hang out in this gray area, that's where the mechanisms of the election can have a major difference. And this is primarily what I work on, looking at what are the mechanics of the election that either boost turnout or suppress turnout. And what we see in Texas, which I think is actually true nationally, and you just said, is that voter registration is the absolute #1 barrier. I'll give you 3 good reasons for that. One, Pew did a really interesting study a couple years ago of people who are not registered to vote and asked them why. Some of them said, I don't care. I don't want to register. I don't care. Stop asking me questions. But about a third of those people, and even more when you looked at younger voters, said, I didn't get around to registering's too hard, I tried and I failed, some combination of that. So we know that there's a lot of people for whom this is a barrier. We also know that after an election, when we look at provisional ballots in Texas, but this is true nationally, that somewhere close to a majority of people who are not able to cast a ballot that counts, but they show up, it's because of registration problems. And then finally, we, unfortunately for those of us in Texas, we do look to states like California, Oregon, but also West Virginia, New Jersey, Georgia, that are actually taking steps to automate voter registration, places that have put same-day voter registration in place, so you show up to vote and you register the same day. States that have done a variety of other measures to encourage voter registration, and all of those states have seen a measurable impact in turnout. And so I'll pause there because I could go on and on.
Well, because I know. Well, if you had to pick, I'll give you one. You can add on if you'd like. But the one thing that is the biggest barrier of all of those things, right? Is it registration? Is it voter ID laws? Is it that these states are culling the voter files based on how active you've been as a voter?
Yeah.
Which one do you think has the most impact on who is actually registering and then coming out and voting?
Again, it's voter registration, but I'm cheating a little bit because that's a very big category. Because when you're
what does that mean? Yeah, tell me what you mean by voter registration.
So if you are trying to suppress voter registration, there's a variety of ways you can go about it that we've seen in Texas is a great example, but we've seen in other states. You can go after government agencies that are supposed to be registering people to vote under the 93 law and make those agencies or somehow ignore that law so that they're not actually doing that. Texas has actually gone so far as to make it illegal to run a voter registration drive. Again, those voter registration drives are the best way we know to engage somebody who's really sitting there and saying, I don't think my vote matters. And so Texas has made that illegal, and it's been very successful. All the national groups have left Texas, and the local groups have had a really hard time complying with the law and running these drives. And then voter purges is another big way. I mean, if maybe somebody gets on the rolls, but then if they get wiped off and they have to start again,
They're not going to get back
yeah,
on,
they're
right?
back at square one. And I'll note that what they're called re-registration systems after Jim Crow were very, I'm not quite the right word, but very popular way to suppress voting in the 1960s once the Voting Rights Act started basically forcing states to allow people of all color to vote. States responded by saying, okay, they can register to vote, but I'm going to make them register to vote every year, and we'll see how many people are able to claw through those barriers. So I think that kind of bundle of things is far and away the biggest barrier we see, although I will add a footnote to talk about later. Photo ID is particularly egregious. Maybe it doesn't have the impact, but the photo ID laws have been designed to go after a particularly vulnerable segment of the electorate, namely poor voters and young voters who disproportionately tend to be voters of color. And so, that's kind of particularly egregious from a moral point of view, but the voter registration problems have a massive
Is the most,
impact.
yeah. Eric, I want you to address this in a more sort of global perspective for a moment. And thinking about, I read something that you had written about You're More Powerful Than You Think, which was your book that you wrote about hierarchies and institutions that are crumbling around us and that citizens are reclaiming their power. Right? This is the time for, this is the citizen-led movement that we're in now. Whether we think about Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement or Parkland students. And yet, we also know there's a great deal of cynicism out there. We also see that people don't believe, for whatever reason, that their vote matters. They haven't been told that their vote matters by politicians, or they do go vote and they see policies that work directly against them. So I want you to sort of address that. And specifically, I found this fascinating. The Pew Research came out with some data the other day. And this goes to the point about how do you get younger people involved, which I'd like you, if you can, to talk about. Each generation is turning out at a lower rate at any given age, right? So the millennials are turning out at a lower rate than when the boomers or the Gen Xers were their age. And this isn't just 18 to 24-year-olds. When the millennials are 30, they're turning out at a lower rate. So it seems to me that the more that we're getting citizen involvement and this idea that I can engage and have a voice, that it is, I don't know, you can make a direct correlation, but I find it interesting that it's less participation in the actual voting process.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to unpack there. I mean, on that point in particular, that decline generation by generation in voting is of a piece with declines in social capital, civic engagement, civic participation all across the board. Same thing, generation by generation, take an age snapshot. There is that long-term decline. One of the messages that I have for young people when we work, at Citizen University, we work all around the United States with people of all ages, but when we're working particularly with young people, I have a very simple message, which is not so much an eat your vegetables message about the duty of voting, but more the idea that there is no such thing as not voting. That not voting is voting, right? Not voting is voting to hand your power over to somebody else and say, please take my power, take my vote, take my voice, and use it against me, right? And when I talk to young people and say, this is basically, not voting is the equivalent of wearing a big old placard that says, kick me. on the back, kick me, on the front, punch me, right? And that message actually has motivated a lot more young people than the kind of, scolding message that I think a lot of older generations will give. But I think there's another dimension to this as well, more globally here. A theme that's been running through all of our comments here has been about motivation to participate, but also invitation, right? I wrote this piece in The Atlantic a couple years ago, remembering that we used to have in the United States this culture of joyful, creative, raucous communal participation around voting in elections. Street theater, open-air debates, dueling parades, bonfires, toasting, right? Now, granted, the electorate then was one that would not include most of us, in fact, any of us, actually. But be that as it may, narrow as that electorate was, say, 200 years ago, there was that culture that voting was not just about voting. Voting was about how you participate in the life of a community, how you have a collective identity, right? And in this piece, what I said was basically, though television killed that culture and now our other screens have really killed it dead, it is in fact possible to revive that kind of culture, particularly if you start locally, right? And so at Citizen University, we launched a program called The Joy of Voting, in which now in 7 cities around the United States that run the gamut from Wichita to Miami to Philadelphia, Grand Forks, St. Paul, Charlotte, all these places, reddish, bluish places. In each place, we're inviting artists, musicians, activists, everyday neighbors, local residents, to come up and generate locally rooted ideas that are basically the 21st century equivalent to the sorts of stuff that used to happen a couple centuries ago. And then we're giving them microfunds to make them happen. And so you get these things in Miami, because Miami is a party town. One of the great ideas there was they had a great all-night dance party with the best, hottest DJ in town, and the only way you could get in was to show that you'd registered to vote, right? In Wichita, in the North End, they got young people, potential voters of color, to participate in a big old graffiti art and street art fair that was all about, again, registration and participation, right? In different towns, different ways that are kind of tailored to the culture of that place. But you first have to invite, right? And to invite people not just to register, but invite people. The substitute for eat your vegetables has to be join the party, right? Join the club. Make this a thing that you want to be part of, not even so much because you should or because, the other party's going to win or because your friend did it, but because there's something purposeful and joyful there, right? And we've found that that's been, in these local elections, in Wichita, in Philadelphia, been moving the dial, right? In turnout and registration.
Though, it seems to me, too, that we're at a cultural, not just because we have TV screens and all kinds of screens that are making community a little bit harder, but I think there's also a sense that if I don't see immediate success, immediate gratification, then I'm not getting my policies move forward. And that seems to me one of the bigger things that we have to educate people about, that the process does take a while, and that you're investing in the long term rather than the immediate payoff.
But political forces only want the immediate payoff. It's always about the next election.
So when you say political forces, what do you mean?
Candidates and consultants.
Candidates, consultants, political parties. They'll come to
Donors.
Latinos and they'll say, this is the most important election of your life. You got to vote this time. And then so someone votes and then...
it doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen.
And then you say, well, why should I vote?
Well, then why should I vote? Because I was lied to.
Yeah, I think
Only once?
This goes back to a broader illiteracy in power that is widespread in our culture and our country right now, right? So the idea that you should be able to vote and get immediate gratification is not just about our culture of immediate gratification, but it's also about people not understanding how systems work, how things get decided, right? Even things that will have a very direct impact on you. And so, one of the things that we've got to do is, this is adjacent to voting, but it's not just about voting, is to boost literacy in power, to kind of teach people the understanding of who decides, how things happen. If you worry about immigration reform, you'd be a fool as either a candidate or a voter to believe that this election is going to fix immigration.
Right.
No, the last decade has shown us it is a long-term slog, right? But I think, number one, you can point to moments of history. I was just in Atlanta, and I was at the Center for Civil and Human Rights there, the incredible museum of the history of the civil rights movement. And you think about King, and you think about that era in the mid-'60s, and most Americans most Americans have no idea the work and the groundwork, the spade work that got put in the 30s and the 40s, litigating, beginning the organizing, pushing back against local Jim Crow laws, all that stuff. This is multi-decade investment, right? And I think the thing that we've got to say about this is, on the power piece, like, I liken voting to, you go into a house that's like dilapidated and broken down, right? And you're like, wow, this house needs a lot of work. I got to repair this house. The first thing you got to do is make sure there's power, right? To me, voting is making sure there's power. Like, the lights will come on. If you plug stuff in, things will work. Then you've actually got to take care of a whole bunch of other stuff. You got to put in drywall. You got to plug the leaks. You got all that stuff. But if you don't first get power established in that broken down house, every other notion of what you want to fix in that house will not come to pass. Voting is turning on the power.
So, Linda?
I guess I would say I'm going to take a contrarian view, because it's like, if the system can't deliver something in 4 years, fuck the system. I mean, really, any 3 people in America can agree on more than our Congress agrees on. So power makes a difference. I mean, in the Virginia elections, today, 400,000 people have health insurance. Elections matter. And I think, I agree with you about changing the whole system, but man, politicians ought to put up on their websites what they promise. They ought to have to report back every 6 months on it. And they ought to get something done, or we ought to get some new politicians or some new parties or something new. I mean,
well, that is precisely how we have President Donald Trump, though. I mean, he came
Right.
in as the ultimate.
That's right.
And you know what?
Stop
He's
believing.
getting things done.
Yeah, stop believing
We may not
everybody's.
like it,
I'm
but
not
he's
saying
getting
that as
things done.
criticism. I'm saying people were ready for
That's
someone
right.
who was going to say,
And they're so
all your
ready for
promises are BS.
Right.
All your little list of pledges are BS. I'm just going to go with the guy who's going to knock over that whole table of your collateral and your little promise statements and the rest.
That's right.
Well, and you know what? The left better take a lesson from that. We better start delivering, because people are out of patience.
Well, but that raises the broader question that I was going to ask. This is for all of you guys to jump in on, which is the behavior piece of Trump is as much as the outcomes of Trump, right?
Yeah.
And what we're seeing now writ large, whether it's the vitriol that we're seeing on Twitter, again, within and among people, whether we have, now we have people, if you work for a Trump administration, don't come to my restaurant. If you, if you think or believe this, I don't want to talk to you anymore. We have families that are now not talking to each other over politics. And it seems to me that then what we're saying is that in order to be engaged in the system, you have to be angry, and that only angry people are going to vote, and then they're going to vote for angry politicians who are then going to promote angry politics. So how do you get us out of this, right? Because the system itself right now is so much about you're voting out people. If Democrats win in 2018, it will be a rebuke to
Right.
Trump rather than a promotion of something more positive. So is that really what we're setting up? Is that we just have cycle after cycle of rebuke, and then we're surprised that we get people who are vindictive and vitriolic?
Well, one of the things I think that's really important, and this is one of the reasons I like these elections, I think governor's elections are really important. Because frankly, governors have to deliver. And as a progressive, for example, I would say, as important as taking back the House is, I think that the most important elections are to elect some progressive governors, because they have to get things done. And I think that we've seen moderate Republicans who really, I mean, we may like them or not, but Kasich got some things done. Kasich said we have to have Medicaid expansion. Kasich said our opioid crisis is going to be on steroids if we don't have the Medicaid funding to try to address it. I mean, governors really have to get things done, or they get thrown out like Brownback. So I think what we should do is elect progressive governors, because I think people keep saying progressive policies don't work, progressive policies don't work. Well, my view is, could we try them for a change? Like, you're having so much success, we're going to critique our side. So let's get some progressive governors, let's get some progressive policies in place. And I think governors can unite their states, because yes, right now it is the two angry people, but that's leaving an awful lot of voters
Right.
in between.
There's a lot of people
who would
in the
like
middle.
to see some solutions.
Chris,
Well, I want to piggyback on that, because I'm fortunate enough to work with probably one of the most popular governors in the country, Larry Hogan in Maryland. And he probably is the
He's a
top
Republican in a very,
Republican?
very blue state of it.
in a Democratic state. But he is a counter to what you just said, Amy,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
your setup was, which is angry, and that sort of thing. He is so popular, 71% approval rating, because he works on getting things done. There is a constituency for people who work together and get things done, and he is proof of that. And I also think some of these women candidates who are running this cycle are they're not talking about being angry and blowing up the system. They're talking about getting things done. So yes, absolutely, angry, polarizing statements motivate each party's base, that's for sure. And the reason Donald Trump is talking about immigration, which on a generic level favors the Democrats, is because it makes his supporters angry and motivated. The border, immigration, whereas Republicans have a generic party handling advantage on taxes and the economy. And if he were a more traditional Republican, that's what the 2018 midterm message for him would be about, but it's not, because he lives in the place of anger drives support. But not all people do, I would just say.
Well, and you can be angry. I mean, Hogan was the first governor in the country to say, I won't send my National Guard to separate families.
Right.
I think that's the thing about Hogan doing that.
He does it, though, in a way, that's why they love him, because he's principled.
Right.
But he doesn't,
But he was
he's not
calm.
angry
He's not
about it.
shouting.
He's not
Yeah,
rude about it, as they say.
So there
Very
is a place.
calm.
So what you're,
I'm not gonna
is
send
that
my
suggesting that that is the new model? Like if the successful Democratic candidate in 2020 will be one who is the opposite of that, of what we have in
If
Trump.
they can get through the primary.
Well, then that's right.
That's
Isn't that the whole
problem.
problem?
That's the whole problem.
Did you want
So I was going to say, at the Texas Civil Rights Project, we very much have a model of being community lawyers, and we represent community groups and try to support this kind of broader movement. And one of the things I'm most excited about right now, that I think went to both of your comments, is, we had a number of organizations in Texas who recognized, one, kind of the money and the message from election to election was not really working for people. And it was the equivalent, please, anybody who sees this, excuse me, of just lighting money on fire. And then also there was no results. And so what a coalition of groups decided to do is did some surveys, talked to some voters, and we, the kind of royal we, are running ballot initiatives in progressive cities in Texas to get paid sick time on the ballot. It's something that polls like 90%. Women, people of color, working folks, because hundreds of thousands of people in Texas, even in these cities alone, don't have access to any paid sick time off when they're sick, when they have to care for kids or whatever. And I'm really proud of the work that our lawyers are doing, but I wanted to throw that out as a really concrete example of something that, we're not election day yet, so we'll see if this works. But the idea is to find an issue and to use that, not just to motivate voters for this election, but to have a conversation that's not a shouting conversation about how government can help make your life better.
Can we do that?
People their power.
And how you as a voter can have the power to make your government better.
The thing that is striking about Hogan is not only that he does things with a pleasant style. It's not just style. I mean, it goes to something deeper in his case and in a bunch of other people's cases. I think there is a coalition of the decent in the American electorate that is activatable.
I hope so.
I'm having trouble hearing that.
Right?
No.
I
I think this is in response to your
I kind
idea.
of resent being called indecent, but
Well,
okay.
no. Decency in the sense of we're not going to just feed on anger and exploitation of fear and so forth, right? This idea that there may be a lot of folks who are Republicans who like some of the things that President Trump has enacted, but whose distaste for his not just style, but there's a certain malevolent joy, actually, and delight in the way that he goes about his business that I think has put off a lot of movable independents and Republicans. And again, this is not just about the midterm elections. This is about how we're going to save the social fabric of this country, right?
Put off a lot of women.
And exactly.
But I will say that as much as I want people to vote because they have hope and aspirations for the future and optimism, hey, anger and fear drives voters and it's driven Latino voters.
But has it? Because we thought in 2016, that was going to be the year.
1994, California.
With Prop 187.
With Prop 187, and that has turned that state around. The Latino electorate has made California the place it is today. And many of us are thinking, is this moment, is Trump or Pete Wilson?
Is it? What do
We'll
you think?
see.
Well, have you seen any? I was just corresponding with somebody in California who said that now that all the votes, or almost all the votes are tallied from the primary election, it does look like Latino turnout now in the primaries is up at general election levels, right? Which would be extraordinary.
Yes. And you know what's funny? On election day, well, the day after the election, I was getting
in 2016 or
no, this election,
this primary in California.
I was getting all of these messages from folks saying, "Why didn't Latinos turn out? Why didn't Latinos turn out?" I'm like, actually, look at what's happening, and people actually believe their own headlines,
right?
Or they'll write their own headlines, and they're wrong.
That you think that is going to make a difference?
I think we're seeing a national moment like we saw in California.
And it will play out in different states, different Senate races, House races.
And the only thing that's going to hold us back is I do not see any significant investment in Latino voter mobilization.
Are you guys working on that?
Well, as I said, I mean, we represent grassroots groups that do the mobilization themselves. So yes, you know, and I'll just note, you know, I keep going back to what you were saying before about Latinos being registered to vote at lower levels, and that is the thing. In Texas, I can tell you, you know, the electorate, the people on the rolls in Texas are gross. They're a gross exaggeration of the rest of the country as far as being whiter, older, richer. And Latinos are much less likely to be registered to vote, which goes back to our earlier conversation, because quite frankly, you know, this might be kind of an experiment. In California, it is a lot easier right now to get on the rolls, and then if you're angry, if you're joyful, whatever's motivating you on election day, you can go in there and cast a ballot that counts. Whereas in Texas, you're gonna have to fight a lot harder, and you're gonna have to do it 30 days out or longer. And so that you know, we might be able to make an argument about the depressive effect that has. Because I don't think in the primary in Texas, at least this year, we saw any sort of uptick.
One of the things that Arturo was saying about people will believe their own evidence or make up their own headlines, people will make up their own narratives about voting and the electorate, right? And you know, I was recently in Tennessee, in Memphis, actually in Nashville for an event that we were doing. And the conversation turned to, well, Tennessee's a red state, right? And this woman who's doing work comparable to your own in mobilizing and supporting those who mobilize voters, she said, well, actually, we don't know whether Tennessee's a red state. What we know is Tennessee is a non-voting state. I think that's a really, really important thing to remember. Tennessee ranks last in the country in voter registration, voter participation. You don't know if you actually had a full electorate turnout, whether it be red, whether it be purple, whether it be something different, right? And I think this is a thing that we've got, it goes straight back to Arturo's point, whether it is a matter of fear and anger that's motivating you or a sense of kind of communal purpose that's more affirmative. Look, President Trump is making a bet. He's very clear about this bet he's making, right? It's not only that he's doubling down on the kind of cultural insecurities and angers of part of his base, but he's betting that folks in this, quote, rising American electorate, young people, people of color, will not in fact rise on election day, will not in fact be motivated to show up. And so it's not just a bet, it's a dare, right? He's daring this electorate, and I think one of the things that we've got to see unfold in this country is whether in fact people are able and willing to push through various barriers to say, we're actually a voting community, we're a voting state.
Well, he got some of the rising American electorate. I mean, until the very, very end, he had pretty high support among Latino men. He depends on the exit poll you look at, either won white millennials or tied white millennials. So I think one thing about anger and fear, you can't just do anger and fear. You have to give people something to vote for. And I really worry about our side. If our side just says he's the devil incarnate, I mean, Trump does give his voters something to vote for, whether we like it or not. And we better give people something to vote for, not just something to vote against.
I want to give the folks in the audience, start thinking about, a lot of people are already raising their hands, so we don't have to tell you to think about your questions. Why don't we go right here and then right there for the first two, right in the front row. You're going to see a mic runner coming to you.
It's Mitzi.
This has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you. I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. On election night, the thing that struck me was most Americans, and I mean most, do not understand how the government works.
Yeah.
And I think we need to have a campaign that makes it easier for non-experts to understand it. I think it needs to be visual. I think a lot of it should be done in cartoons or in comic strips. No, you have to make it easy. And it needs to be visual because it's a process that in fact changes.
Yeah.
Journalists like to use words. We need to bring artists in working with journalists to tell these stories. And if you have any ideas about how to do this, thank you.
Right.
Yeah, well, this is precisely the spirit of a lot of the Joy of Voting projects that have been unfolding in cities around the country, where artists have been creating graphic novels or novelized pamphlets about what it means to participate, who fought for the rights for you to vote, and so forth. And I think even beyond kind of, painting and graphic art, video games actually. So one of the most important platforms out there, which some of you may have heard of in past Ideas Festivals, retired Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, when she left the Supreme Court, made this her mission. She created an organization called iCivics, iCivics.org, and it is a platform for teaching civics entirely through video games, aiming at middle school students. They've now been moving up to high school students as well. And it's incredibly sophisticated, standards aligned, with really good quality video games that are about every dimension, not just federal elections, but how you govern and how you participate in the life of a city, and so forth. And I think that kind of engagement that allows you to play it and to see it as much as to read about it has got to be more and more part of our repertoire.
People need to know about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't know about it.
Well, she's been doing this in partnership with public schools around the country, and they're up to a few million public school students every year who are using the iCivics
That's really
platform.
cool.
Yeah, Justice Sotomayor now has sort of taken the baton for that project.
The difference, though, I think, in terms of our political dialogue, this is certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, is that it's one thing to have, we've had negative campaigns forever and ever and ever, but they were really focused on the person, right? Don't vote for Celinda because she hates puppies and she's a terrible person, right? Vote for me.
Mama, where's your pop?
Right. But what's happened, and I do blame the political consulting class, not to offend anyone up on here, but that the message has not just simply been Celinda's a terrible person, but the whole institution is terrible, right? So we've been telling people that candidates, consultants have been telling voters, whatever message they're getting from their video games about how important civics are, the message that they're getting every year when they go to vote is the system is broken, Washington is corrupt, the swamp is taking over, so that it's now impossible. How are you supposed to believe in a system that we've been told over and over again is inept and corrupt? And that's a bigger problem than just getting a generation to learn about how a bill becomes law in Schoolhouse Rock. I think you had the microphone next, yes.
So that's just my question. I register voters, and I often get people who say, I'm not voting because...
I'm sorry, where do you do this?
I actually do it abroad. 6 million Americans live overseas, so I specialize in registering American voters overseas. And if you reach someone who says, I'm not voting, the number one thing they say to you is they're both corrupt. Citizens United, it's the money, it's even some of your companies. I mean, these companies, I also fundraise, there's a lot of money pouring into politics, and it's an industry. And these people feel that maybe their vote really doesn't matter. And how do I communicate to that voter standing in front of me? I try to say, well, what about, this issue in your state or that issue? But it's hard.
Yeah.
But I tell them if you're not going to vote for yourself, vote for your kid. And that is a powerful message, at least for Latino voters.
Yeah.
Really powerful. I mean, I think you can say to people, too, they're right. You know what? I don't care what our issue is, and this isn't what the topic of this panel, so I hope you'll forgive me, Amy.
Yeah,
we ought to be for campaign finance reform. If we're not, we're crazy. We're not going to get a thing we want. So tell them they're right. But how are we going to get campaign finance reform? We have to elect elected officials who will be for campaign finance reform. We got a record number now, now, standing up against Citizens United. And if they don't produce on it, if they get corrupted by the system, then we need the next new batch. We have to get campaign finance reform. And you can do it by initiative.
Well, I think by, in addition to the message of there's no such thing as not voting, right, which I think is really, do you want to be a sucker? Do you want to be somebody's chump, right? Okay, great. But I think the other thing too, in terms of, this may not be so applicable to the American voters abroad who you're mobilizing, but I think for all of us who are living our civic lives rooted in place, all citizenship is local in just the same way that all politics is local, right? And in local politics, it still is possible, not only because mayors and governors actually have to deliver on some stuff, but because it's at a scale where you can, if you get enough citizens engaged in something, you can move through a policy. I live in Seattle, where in the neighboring town of SeaTac, the little airport town, populated mainly by immigrant workers who work at the airport in the hospitality industry around the airport. They mobilized and organized after their second shift. People who had no business, who had every excuse to say, I'm too busy. What's it going to affect me? They mobilized and they organized to get CTAC to pass a $15 minimum wage, which then created this domino effect to make the Seattle council and mayoral elections tip that way. And everybody had to raise their hand and say they were 15 now. And all of that happened because a group of, precisely the kind of the rising American electorate who don't usually show up, showed up. And I think those kinds of stories can motivate people to see what they can do.
Anyone else? We'll go right to you, and then I want to make sure I get people over here, these folks right back there.
Yeah, Rob Koretz from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and don't judge me from the state I'm from.
I love Oklahoma.
I have Oklahoma ties.
But quick question going back to the 18-year-olds, which I think is very important in terms of the numbers. But historically, I would think that kids or 18-year-olds vote as their household or their parents voted. Any sense whether this generation of 18-year-olds will vote as their parents voted or vote based on their life experiences?
That's a great point, because I'm sort of I came out as a legacy Republican in the 80s, and that's when I made my contract because my parents were and everyone we knew and that sort of thing. I don't think this generation are legacy voters in terms of what their family was. I think they're more shaped by current events, specifically these school shootings. And that's a really great question. I mean, they are very, if you look at the generations, they are much more progressive. They are much more likely to be Democrats than their parents in the Gen X or the baby boom generations, for sure. So, yeah, I mean, some may be doing that, but I don't think like it used to be.
So, Linda, you've had good research on these, these
it's actually
new
very,
voters.
very true that and the millennials were the first cohort where you really saw some cohort effects. Well, actually the boomers because of Vietnam. So, and I was born and raised a Republican too, but I became a Democrat because of Vietnam and the women's movement and stuff. That was the first break. And then what's really interesting is it's very formed by these early years. And then during your life, you're significantly more likely to change your spouse than to change your party ID, for example. So, just saying, current statistic. I'm not recommending it. I'm just quoting the stat. So, yeah, you're right. The very formative years that are influenced, if there's a crisis during your formative years, or otherwise it's legacy. But when there are crises, and I think these Parkland kids do see that as a crisis appropriately so, then they'll be very influenced by their cohort effect, just like the Vietnam generation was very influenced by Vietnam.
Who has a microphone? I want to get someone in the back there.
So I appreciate your comment about local governments. And everybody's wondering, how do we get people engaged? Everybody, when we talk about government, typically talks about the governor and talks about the federal level. But people forget how powerful it is to engage with your city council and with your mayor. Yeah. Your mayor and your city council members are actively talking to citizens on a regular basis. And if you want people to start having trust and faith in the system, you get them connected with the level that is closest to them. And then if your policymakers are successful, they engage them, they get them to volunteer, they get them to start creating social action, and then you start moving forth into the other things. But if you don't engage with that basic level, and then most importantly, if you don't educate the populace with regards to what that role is, because you'd be surprised on how many people at the mayor level are being asked, hey, what are you going to do about Medicare reform? So we need to create a campaign of educating and empowering those mayors and those council members to have the resources to reach back into their communities once they're elected, so they can both empower the citizens and start bringing about policies that create the trust that we're missing in our communities.
Will you tell us who you are?
Yeah.
I'm Michelle de la Isla, mayor of the city of Topeka.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, you're right.
Yeah.
That's
You
what I
are
wanted
right.
her to say.
Okay, it might be harder for you to move. I was going to invite you to come to Texas. Exactly our
Maybe she could do a
strategy and our
sister,
approach.
mayor program.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one last question before we go. This is our final one. Yeah.
My name is Sara Gelser. I'm a state senator from Oregon, where we really believe in voting.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the national focus on automatic voter registration and registration of 16-year-olds. But what has really driven our voter participation is statewide vote by mail.
Yeah,
And
vote
I'm
by
wondering
mail,
what is the barrier to national vote by mail? And coupled with that, it really activates the disability community. Who is working to activate voters with disabilities who are an incredibly important political force in the United States?
And also, the one thing about vote by mail, can they count it better? We have to wait for like 2 weeks before we get Oregon.
We generally know by about, every time I run, usually by about 8:06 p.m.
Really?
When the polls close at 8. There's some counties that are
Okay.
slower, but we generally know by midnight that night.
Maybe it's Washington State. That's bad.
Well, it all depends on how much early voting.
Depends on how,
Yeah, right.
and it depends on how close the election are and how many
Yeah.
provisionals
Yeah.
we have.
You know, the only concern I have about vote by mail, and I do think it makes voting more accessible to more people. For Latinos who are very, transient and they change addresses and they move, that may present an unintended consequence.
Wait, this is actually a real question. Are these ballots pre-stamped?
Oh, that's such a great question.
Because I'm telling
we
you, I
would
don't
like
think my
them to
daughter
be.
could find a stamp if somebody handed her a
I'll go. My husband can.
right? I mean, like, who does the mail? So
Right, they aren't pre-stamped. We've talked about that specifically with younger voters who just don't really even know what a stamp is.
No, they
but
do
you
not.
can hand deliver them. We have ballot boxes all around communities at
You drop?
libraries. You just take it, you drop it off, and for people that have moved, you can also go to any elections office and say, "I didn't receive my ballot." You show your ID. You get
A
the
lot of
ballot.
Latino voters, though, are not going
Right,
to go.
not going to show their ID.
Not just Latinos.
Yeah, well, a lot of voters,
Latino.
that's
Poorer
right.
voters.
There's absolutely no, well, I mean, I don't understand why we spent all this money every place, but we decided we were going to do elections on the cheap. That's where we're going to save the last dollar? Why don't we pay the postage?
I think we should.
That's right.
So in Washington State, which is a vote by mail state,
Yep.
we now will be paying
Yeah.
prepaid postage for everything.
Yeah.
You know, I'm of mixed mind about voting by mail. I mean, it certainly does boost participation. So I suppose that is the bottom line. But of course, it also removes what older generations thought of as a ritual of actually going to vote and be with others to vote. And so I think what has to happen, and what's beginning to happen in Washington State, is people are making up new rituals, like ballot parties, you know, where you kind of bring your ballots and you talk about them together, you know, over dinner, over cocktails, and then you'll mail them together, right? Those different kinds of rituals will have to emerge. But again, the idea underneath it all is that the more that voting is seen as an isolated, individualistic act, the less likely we're going to be to raise turnout. It's got to be done
Except
in
vote by
community.
mail states, Eric, are like 80% turnout.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of sense of people filling out ballots
Yes,
together.
and I love that
exactly
idea.
kind of
Right.
thing.
And I was just going to, the last note, happy to talk to you after the panel. We're working with a kind of coalition of disability rights groups that have been banding together and focus specifically on boosting civic engagement among that population.
Thank you to this great panel. Thank you guys for good questions. Fantastic.